The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Excited for this one. So welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And it's where all the cool kids come to sense make what is happening right now in our world. And I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa. So for those of you who've been here a while, we know the Stoa had featured sensemakers such as Benita Roy's Psychotechnology Playgrounds, Emil Berger's Live Players, and Patrick Ryan Stark Stoa. And now that we're growing, we're launching a Sensemaker in Residence series. And these will be 4 sessions that happened for the duration of a month. So for example, we have Zach Stein coming in, doing one on meta psychology. Dave Snowden's doing naturalizing sense making. And today, the first session of this series, new series called Network Tribalism, features John Robb. So to introduce John, he's a military analyst, entrepreneur, and author of a book, Brave New World. And he releases something called the Global Guerrillas Report, which is a report that covers the intersection of war, politics, and technology with the goal of providing frameworks needed to make sense of our relentlessly chaotic world. And how the series is going to work and how today's is going to work, John is going to kind of share his thoughts on network tribalism, and we're going to have a conversation, a collective conversation. I will warm up with some questions, and then if you have a question, put it in the chat box, and then I'll call you to unmute yourself and ask John your question. This will go on YouTube, so if you want to read your question on your behalf, let me know. This will be an hour, and we'll have kind of a sense-making session, 30-minute optional sense-making session afterwards. So that being said, I will allow John to unmute himself. And John, maybe you can just kickstart us off by adding anything else and then jumping right into it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. What I'd like to do is just kind of go over some of the basics of network tribalism and what's driving it and how I stumbled into it. You know, one of the best ways of making sense of what we're going through right now is to frame it within the context of network tribalism. And it's a network tribe is a cohesive social structure that sprung up online, and it is driving our politics. It's driving our social response. It's driving much of the seeming chaos around us. I came into the subject, back in 2003, 2004, when I started the Global Guerrillas blog. You know, what I saw in Iraq with the counterinsurgency wasn't matching the analysis, the traditional analysis on how insurgencies operate. What I saw was an insurgency operated very much like a lot of what I saw online with open source software development and online behaviors. And that led to a long process of analysis that eventually resulted in the book Brave New War in 2007. And what I described then is an open source insurgency, an insurgency that wasn't made up of a single group, that mirrored the nation state in terms of how it organized itself with a political wing and economic wing, et cetera. This insurgency was made up of dozens of different groups. In the case of Iraq, it was 70 different groups, and they all seemed to be able to work together in order to fight the United States and the Iraqi government. And they did this using an open source dynamic. It made it really tough to eliminate. So when the counterinsurgency forces, found a low-level member of a group, typically that would result in flipping them and then going up the chain of command, up the pyramid, until you hit the planning cell, and then you'd wipe them out and the whole thing would collapse. In this case, they'd go up a level, maybe 2, and the group would evaporate. It'd be gone. That was the extent of the group's depth. And there were 69 other groups to take their place, and then another group would emerge almost instantaneously. And the way they operated together was through a kind of an open source innovation tinkering approach. Instead of a master strategy or a master plan coming down from on high, they tinkered at the low levels and tried things out. And whatever stuck against the wall, you throw things against the wall, whatever sticks works. And then if that works, everybody copies it and they implement it. And the communications mechanism was something I identified as a Stigmergic out of insects and like ants and bees, is that when something worked, it was like a chemical trail being left for others to follow. And they used the press to share that information. So if an attack was successful in terms of the target, in terms of the technique, that would be covered by the press, and the press would then be the chemical trail for others to follow and replicate. Open source insurgencies became open source protests during the Arab Spring. They were big enough to topple governments in Egypt and Tunisia, eventually in Egypt, and led to the civil war in Syria. Open source protests don't have a cohesive leadership. They, many times they were saying that they just started online using a Facebook message, and once they got going, they grew very, very rapidly, and they were impossible to shut down. Most recently in the States, we saw them in the election in 2016. Just before that, we had Occupy and we had the Tea Party movement, both open source movements, mostly in reaction to the 2008 financial crisis. And that led to something a little bit more formal, an open source insurgency that took over the Republican Party and used Trump as a weapon to take over the White House. So that kind of set us up into the current situation. I approached the whole thing as a kind of a breakdown of my way into this was through looking at this as a breakdown of the nation state, a kind of a post-Westphalian lens that came out of the warfare space. Martin Van Creveld and Bill Lind and others had been writing about this, the rise of fourth generation warfare, this idea that because large-scale conventional war wasn't possible anymore due to nuclear weapons, the scale of the conflict had dropped. It was being fought at a very low level, at the guerrilla level, at the unconventional level. And that as we globalized, the nation state broke down, and that because the nation state broke down, they weren't able to deliver the political goods, and that groups would arise within the nation state and across nation states that would challenge it for dominance. And they would use these unconventional methods to take it on. So, open source insurgencies fit within that framework for me. It was my way in. It proved that it was capable of taking down states directly through external force, taking down even a governor in Puerto Rico lost to an open source protest. And then also taking over the government of the United States through an election process. And then as I got into the topic and I started the Global Guerrillas Report, I started finding other threads in. Two other ones in particular. One was the McLuhan perspective, is that that social technology, kind of the social technology I helped build back in 2001 that became social networking, had rewired our brains. And we think differently than we used to. Very similar to what happened back with the printing press. When the printing press hit, it rewired us. It made, for instance, in terms of religion, it made Bibles accessible. I mean, even priests in the 1500s didn't have a full Bible. I mean, they had excerpts, and they only read tiny portions of it. It was all largely taught through an oral tradition. So that rewiring that went on with the printing press was occurring now with us online, and it was changing the way we were thinking. And because it was changing the way we were thinking, it would change the way we organize socially as a kind of an after effect. And some of the ways it changed us is that we started to think it less as a kind of you read something in its entirety and you know, in isolation as an individual and form your opinions through that reading. The kind of long form approach to the kind of short staccato rhythm of lots and lots of information, too much information to process is flowing over you. And what you do is you just pick the pieces out of that flow that make sense, and you can fit into a pattern that you are curating. That pattern making, that pattern matching is constant now. I mean, we are constantly pattern matching. We can't handle the flow of information that's coming over us. And the social consequences of that is that pattern matching turns into kind of a pattern curation. It becomes a shared pattern that millions of people are curating, and that forms the basis of tribalism. A third one is it came out of the David Roenfeld's Timon analysis, tribes, institutions, markets, networks. He's posited that we are on the verge of a new social decision-making system, which is a kind of a positive way to look at it, that this network piece could become something to rival the existing decision-making systems that got us out of the Middle Ages. Things like tribes became nationalism, institutions, you know, basic bureaucracy became the powerhouse behind science, behind technology, behind corporate structures, behind government, and that markets stitched it all together, great at information finding, you know, great at allocation of resources. Those three started off very rough, and they were refined over time to be largely beneficial. Because we're on a macro level, we're certainly a hell of a lot better off now than we were 500 years ago. So what do networks add? And the problem with a new social decision-making system is that it's really rough, and it can be abused, and it could be emerge malformed and cause all sorts of problems. I mean, think of the kind of the worst case scenario with bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is great at mobilizing resources and getting things done at scale, but it doesn't have any moral compass. It's just a set of procedures that work in a hierarchy with you know, many people following rote job descriptions and orders that come down from on high. And the abuse of that ended up in, say, concentration camps, or ended up in the totalitarianism of communism, where you had a single bureaucracy running everything. And, you know, and the same thing would be with markets. I mean, early markets were definitely very brutal in terms of how unequal the income distribution and the wealth distribution was. So you'd starve even though the market was free. So network decision-making, what is that? Well, we got a little taste of it, and I'm trying to, you know, piece it together as I'm going along, but it operates differently than the other three. It's to a certain extent more powerful than the other three. It works on a dynamic between consensus and dissent. A functional network decision-making system. Consensus is that we all agree to do something. And if it's working correctly, that something is very narrow and it's situation specific, and it lasts for a short period of time until that task is done or till that goal is achieved. We got that initially with the COVID response. We all pretty much agreed that we wanted to stop it from taking root in the United States. And that we took a lot of action as individuals that slowed it down. We pretty much used that network consensus to shut down the country, to move to work from home, to reorganize ourselves in ways that muted the response. Well before the state, the bureaucracy, actually made the decision to do anything. And that was all done with an absence of information, even though the FDA, CDC screwed up and didn't get any tests produced. I mean, we had no feedback loop through all of February and into late March. because we did, at beginning of March, we only had 300 tests a day in a nation of 330 million because of that screw up. And even that didn't stop the network from responding effectively. Not effective enough, but it shows the power of the system. And the dissent, and the other part is the dissent, the dynamic. The dissent will actually constantly pick away at the consensus and make sure that it doesn't persist beyond its shelf life, or that doesn't exceed its reach. And we've seen that with the COVID response as the consensus flailed at actually solving the problem. The dissent grew and grew and grew, and it continues to grow. The dissent prevents the consensus from locking things in. And that, that's a functional decision-making system, and with refinement over time, maybe over decades, maybe over a century, we could get that thing working in a way that actually yields some benefit. I mean, just the way that we combined markets with bureaucracy, that we used the market system to elect leaders that ran bureaucracies through, elections. That kind of combination, that kind of cross-fertilization could be beneficial. The problem is that when it is dysfunctional, that the consensus can lock everything in. It can lock everything down into a single cohesive view. And it could be so total in its using network technologies, using interconnections, the way we run our economy, the way we run our society, that it will prevent anything else from happening. The opposite being true is that the dissent could win and we end up in just perpetual chaos. My fear is more the total lockdown. And if you look internationally, you could say maybe China is more the consensus-driven approach. They're moving towards a total lockdown in order to make themselves more capable of handling the stresses of a globalized environment, but at a massive reduction in freedom of movement and innovation. And then the dissent side would be more like Russia, where everything is just chaotic constantly. And the only people that benefit is like the core of interlocked, corrupt companies that are at the center of things. Network tribes emerge out of the consensus. And what we're seeing now is a consensus that through pattern matching has built up tribes that dominate the conversation. They've taken to the streets and they're rolling up political power. And the fear is that over time, maybe even just a year or two, that we could end up in a consensus lockdown, into a tribal lockdown. Because these tribes aren't just an opinion, they start to become cohesive social units due to the dynamics of tribalism. Tribalism works really, really well online. Even McLuhan would say that when we became global villagers, we've re-tribalized. We're not, global village always seemed so hopeful, is that we were all together, but it's actually global villagers are backbiters. They're constantly monitoring each other's behavior. They're constantly in each other's business, and they kill outsiders. They kill people who deviate. I mean, some of the worst things happen, of course, at the tribal level, at the village level, when somebody does not conform. So that kind of gives you a background going in, and I'm opening up to any kind of questions that want to go on from here.
Great. So if you have any questions, start throwing it in the chat box right now. Yeah, just to flag something before I forget, David Ronfeld, the Timid Framework, he's coming in on August 26th to talk about this new thing called Whose Story Wins. So that should be cool. I'll warm you up with a few questions, and we'll go to the questions in the chat. Is there anything that you would like to prime us with, this group that's here live, or people that are watching this on the YouTube channel, something that's at your edge of your thinking, ideas that you would like to stress test throughout these 4 weeks at this series that we have?
At the very edge, well, there's a big debate in my head in terms of how this conflict rolls out, right? And so I'm working through that, and what that means for the U.S. Coming up through the election and after this election. I think the election is both more important and less important than many people think. I mean, this tribal conflict is actually the thing that's dominant underneath the scenes. And then I have some thinking that I was been doing in terms of the kind of reforms or tweaks to the system that we could make that would give us a path out, and that not only out of this, but that would set in motion a set of changes and a set of social dynamics that would improve our lives over the long term. And that has to do with data ownership and thinking in terms of data ownership and kind of creating a version of that online that moves your interests forward. But you can't get that without ownership. And there's a lot of questions about that. Maybe that would be the last session. Right?
And so the question I had is kind of the current players in this sort of culture war 2.0, or this kind of this just tribal warfare that's happening, right, like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, QAnon. You have any thoughts on how that is playing out with the current election?
Yeah, well, the tribes, and this is interesting, typically in the past, tribalism was driven forward by a positive narrative, a positive story. And this is why, a story that says, this is why we are better together. This is why you are special. This is why, we should stick together. And this is here are all the things that we've done together in order to overcome adversity. Tribes in the online world don't form based on this positive narrative. They form based on a pattern that describes their enemies, a pattern of behavior that is descriptive of what they oppose. So that pattern becomes the basis of fictive kinship. Fictive kinship is a way to extend your connection to people beyond actual blood relationship. It's the basis of nationalism. It's the basis of any kind of large-scale group cohesion. And the thing is, you need that fictive kinship in order to make things work. Because without that fictive kinship, there's a chance, and it becomes almost self-fulfilling, is that you won't trust, or people won't trust what other people are saying to them, because they don't think that they are connected. They're not kin in any even a loose sense, that whatever they say is false. Even the most basic fact, even the most basic observation that they have is seen as something malicious. And we're at that stage now as the nationalism, our former form of fictive kinship, dissolves, is weakened. As we punch holes in it, we're less trusting of everybody else. We don't even agree on the basic facts because we don't trust that the other person presenting those facts, those observations, are being truthful. So in the case of online tribes, these negative patterns are curated by millions of people, and they go out and they find examples of these every day. And that if they can find a video of it or something that has kind of empathic content, they post it, and then everyone goes, I knew it. That's example of what this pattern means, or this is everywhere. The big patterns I've seen right now is, I put those in my most recent report, is you have the anti-racists, the anti-fascists, you have on the right tribes, you have more the anti-terrorists, the anti-Americans, which are basically the anti-traitors, right? And there are a lot of other little minor tribes that are less effective below that. So far, the left tribes are stronger. I mean, granted, they have more of a driver. They see Trump in the White House, and they've been cast as an existential threat, and that has driven tribe growth. The right tribes have been slower to form. Largely because they have Trump in the White House, which serves kind of as a bulwark, as long as he's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. He's kind of as long as he's still in place, the existential threat from what's going on in Portland and other places doesn't seem as dire. And then once he's removed, that could change. And also, Trump is not sticking to the patterns. He jumps around. And that jumping around means he's not, helping the tribes form at all. He throws out things every once in a while that are tribal specific, and like for instance, when he sent the security force, the security detail to Portland, that was to try to get this kind of anti-terrorist, anti-anarchist kind of tribal movement going. It wasn't really that effective because people didn't see them as existential threats to the degree necessary to get that rolling. But there may be some mechanisms that he may be able to play to do that. But in general, he's not helping the tribalization on the right. So yeah, I could keep on going. You want to switch a question or?
Yeah. Okay, I'll just sneak in one follow-up question because it was really interesting. Because I agree that my read on the kind of the culture war 2.0 is that people on the right, the tribes on the right, they're more fragmented than the tribes on the left, which makes them less, I guess, potent or powerful. With one exception that seems to be rising is the QAnon tribe. Could you speak a little bit on that?
I think QAnon, for the most part, they're driven by pattern matching, right? And they a pattern of conspiracy that's arrayed against them, right? And that they are a malformed tribe of the right, largely, but they can cross. It's because the right tribalism hasn't really flourished, hasn't really taken off. And people would say, oh yeah, well, Trump's in office, but it's really, he's not leading a tribe per se. He led an insurgency, the open source insurgency, to get into power. He's more of a weapon they placed in power to kind of a grenade that constantly goes off and disrupts things. But he's not a tribal leader in that regard. So QAnon is formed out of itself. I think it would be eaten up once the tribes on the right start to form. It'll just be absorbed right in. It'll disappear. Right now, it's just out there, and it shows the power of pattern matching and how identifying with it and constantly adding to it and growing a pattern can actually be powerful. It helps people make sense. It helps people deal with the overload of information and the chaos around them.
Okay, cool. Let's switch to some questions in the chat. Benita Roy, you have a question. If you can unmute yourself.
So I actually have two questions that kind of like wrapped in one question. So maybe you can help me suss it out. And that is, what kind of recommendations can you make or that people are making to change the way the algorithms on social media either contribute to a functional network kind of decision making, or detract or obstruct that? I mean, it seems to me that we're studying social media that is not incentivized to have a functional network intelligence, right? And yet still you're seeing some of these effects. So how consciously could we so just to comment on that, and then what tags along with that, because you guys were talking about QAnon, is if the level of pattern recognition that is creating tribes is of such low bandwidth, isn't that a potential threat for AI to capitalize on creating the illusion of pattern inside some of these conversations, and kind of igniting and flaring up tribes that's not really coming from a human-centric or human response? So I just have questions on that level. I hope that somehow they make sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, from a McLuhan perspective, okay, he said that in order for us to survive what we're going through right now, we may eventually need to turn society into a technological artifact. All right? It was just kind of like a little offhand comment that he made, but it made a lot of sense, is that something that would actually mediate the conversation in a way that turns it positive, just like we harness bureaucracies and we put in place rules for them, and put in place rules for markets and how that works. But to do this on a network scale, you actually have to have something that can handle billions of interactions and billions of people, and that can only be done through AI. And if you look at it from that perspective, a lot of what we're seeing, the battle between the tribes, is over who gets to control how that technological artifact is built. Who gets to set what it's trained against, what it's trying to optimize. And that means it's kind of a battle for the future right now. So if one tribe dominates and it can then dictate and force all the big social networks and the technology companies to come after that into alignment, and that they are constantly seeking out behaviors that they find objectionable or an existential threat, whether it's on the tribes on the right or tribes on the left, then it's lockdown time. And that we get locked in using this technology into a single way of thinking, a single approach to the world. And it's opaque and it's hidden and it's not something that you can avoid because it's baked into all the technology platforms. I mean, AI will be into every single product that we touch within the next 10 to 20 years, every single one. And it's in all the services that we touch. So that's kind of the great lockdown. That's what I call the long night. One of the mechanisms for the long night is that once that locks down, and then once you see it propagated across countries, is that you just get this narrow orthodoxy that doesn't innovate, doesn't change, where people are keeping their heads down for fear of ever crossing into the territory that would eliminate their jobs and eliminate their future. I don't see how you get rid of that at that point, because it's so pervasive. And that's like a civilization killer. It's an end game. So that answer your question? I mean, yeah, I think I answered it.
Yeah. So it makes me realize, like, there's a persistent confusion. Like, there's all this like war on sense making, but there's a sense that I'm hearing from you, and it's really a thought that I have, is that our persistent need to make the whole information ecology make sense pushes us toward wanting this kind of lockdown you're talking about.
Right.
And I think the challenge is, because we got all these people trying to like figure out, crack the nut, make sense out of this. And I think what you're saying is we have to shift our way of dealing with a much broader information ecology, where the dissenting and the noise is part of the information ecology.
Right.
And it's this other need, this hangover we have, now that we see all of it, to want to lock it down and make sense, is the danger. And this is like what I've been trying to say about all these other war on sense-making factions, is because that whole impulse is in the direction of the threat you're naming.
Right. Yeah, and that a functional system using network decision-making, it's a network social decision-making system, has consensus and dissent.
Right.
It has to, you've got to have that dissent in order to make sure that the consensus doesn't kill us.
Yeah, and it works like the brain. This is why you can go in and see competing intentions all the time, because some are sub-threshold, because if the intention you have starts to be not evolutionarily contextual anymore, then the other one comes. And so this is, I think, a message that I'm very happy to hear. This needs to be made, because the same people that you're talking to are making this mistake.
Right.
They just want it to be locked down in their direction.
Correct.
That's the whole move.
Right.
That's the mistake.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome.
Cool. Michael Underwood, you had a few questions. Feel free to pick which one that's most alive right now for you. If you can unmute yourself, Michael.
Hey, I don't think I have a well-prepared enough question, so I'll just pass. I'll just add that I think if you look at, you reframe the problem a bit around truth, and you have this consensus in the mainstream media, and then you have the insurgency in the various tribes. You know, you could consider a popular streamer to be his own network tribe, and they can be co-opted and directed wherever you want. But that's the mainstream media versus these tribes, and it's the narrative is like a football. And directionally, I think they're, so like, for example, QAnon, some of his predictions are directionally more accurate than CNN. And I just think that's interesting in terms of, we were told that there was all this Russia collusion stuff, but then it didn't happen. So I think that's kind of the interesting thing is there used to be 3 news agencies that could really trick the population. Now the population has more of a chance to sense make on its own.
Right. Yeah, that's in general a collapse of the existing decision-making systems. Jordan Hall, my friend Jordan, calls that the collapse of the blue church, kind of the liberal establishment. That the ability to control messaging through the big media has been eliminated, has been undermined. And a lot of it's been self-inflicted. I mean, the big decision-making systems have really screwed up. I mean, particularly in the United States, more so than almost everywhere else. With response to 9/11, going in and invading Iraq and using WMDs, which was clearly a misdirection, a lie in order to do it, and then saying, it's always on the edge of actually being solved. I mean, 17 years of saying that in Afghanistan, 18 years. Next year will be better. And then, the idea that, unlimited trade with China, essentially the same government that had, gone through the Cultural Revolution and fought us during the Cold War, would reform them, and that it would be universally good for all of us if we just let it go. When, you had Al Gore in 2000, in front of Congress saying, hey, we should get them into the WTO and open things up. And then here we are, a totally unmanaged relationship, and China's accelerated global warming. Even if you may or may not agree with that, it's like accelerated global warming by 20 to 30 years through its pollution-heavy industrial expansion, and exactly the opposite of what Gore was intending. But it shows the kind of screw up, and that now we have a peer competitor, a technological peer competitor that's becoming increasingly tyrannical. I mean, it's got a tyrant. It's got a guy who says he's president for life. So, and they have a lockdown, they're locking down their society. And then you had the financial crisis, which I think really, really got this whole ball moving, is that you have a crisis that costs about $23 trillion in economic damage. And if you dug into it and you've been watching that at the time, it was just fraud as high as a mountain of fraud. And people selling direct to pension funds. I mean, it was just, everybody was having their way with the system. And nobody was held accountable for it. None of the people who brought this on us were sent to jail for it. And, I mean, it was intentional, hiding of what had actually gone on and burying it, after the fact, and saying, well, we all have, blood on our hands. Let's not look at this. And that caused the Tea Party and Occupy to go. It kicked them off. And that brought open source to, movements into the United States. And those morphed over time. And they've become tribes since then. So, it's the dysfunction of that, that blue church, that liberal establishment of the existing decision-making systems. It's their inability to get things done and done in an effective way. I mean, even the current COVID crisis, with the FDA giving the CDC monopoly production rights over the testing, and then they flubbed it, and then the slow release of power to the rest of the public health labs to ramp up production. And that put us behind by about a month and a half. And that was critical. I mean, almost all the casualties the U.S. has suffered, you know, the high rates were all in those early days because we didn't even have a feedback loop. We didn't have any mechanism to, you know, to screen people or respond because there was no way of knowing who was sick. 300 tests a day in March 1, that's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. But again, bureaucracy. And I can understand the thinking of, you know, the FDA to do that. I mean, it was doing it because it was emphasizing quality over quantity. It wasn't recognizing the imminence of the threat. But nonetheless, again, bureaucratic failure, bureaucratic decision-making failure. And then the coverage afterwards by the media is they're not even focusing on what really went wrong. They're focused on other issues. So, yeah, I mean, it's a decision-making failure across the board. Boy, there's a lot of questions, it seems like. I've been watching this chat go and go and go.
Yeah, there's a lot of juicy questions. Brian Keith, you have a question about religion.
Yes, sir. Hello, John. The question is, we have some religions that in the past were very effective at forcing people into certain ways of thinking and not allowing people to deviate. We've seen in some parts of the world, religions are still very good at this. The question is, in the United States, do you think it is possible for any mainstream religion outside, let's say, Mormonism, that still has a pretty good lock on people, to reassert itself as being the primary source of truth in the networked age?
Yeah, there are a lot of religious aspects to the tribalism we see. There is, you know, I mean, you could describe a lot of the tribalism on the left is very puritanical, and that is it fights using a moral warfare, very similar to the way religions fight, and that's definitely playing a part. I mean, that's, you know, religion is to a large extent a tribal decision-making system. It's the guardian of the kind of moral infrastructure, kind of the ethical infrastructure, the key of, you know, who we are, and that we're seeing that subsumed by tribes. I mean, you know, that happened with the printing press. Is that, I mean, you know, when Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church, he wasn't like alone in that. There have been plenty of challenges doing exactly the same thing that he did, except that when he, you know, nailed his theses up on the door of the cathedral, that was ripped off and then went out to printing presses, and 100 copies came back. And then the pamphlets and dissenting voices, you know, appeared everywhere, and you know, vernacular Bibles appeared everywhere, and that fragmented that universal church. So you know, there is a kind of a thing going on here with network decision making that's similar. Yeah, it's interesting. Whoever takes up the kind of moral warfare banner, and we're seeing that in network tribalism, is kind of a replacement for a lot of what the traditional religions have done in terms of you know, creating an orthodoxy and creating a view of the world that coheres people. So I don't really have a full answer on what happens to the traditional churches. I do see that mainstream Protestantism has been undergoing a kind of universal collapse, and that there are some churches that have been relatively effective at retaining their flocks, but we're going to see very soon how well they can move into the online world, into the network world, and if they can't, it'll be tough for them.
Brian, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the Catholic Church as a microcosm of the big question, where we see some people in the Catholic Church, like let's say if you read Anne Barnhart, who is very traditionalist, hardline, saying the current Pope is not the real Pope is still the previous Pope, and very dogmatic, zealous, and promulgating a view of Catholicism that is very specific and very, here's how we're going to behave in the way we think of old tribes. And then you have most Catholics that are not like that. And it may be that in Catholicism, we can see the fight between the small, we retain the real truth, fighting against the modernization, like where the Pope, the current official Pope, is far more liberal than Catholics in the past. And so I'm curious, John, if you have any opinion about what's happening in the Catholic Church in particular.
In general, I think it's much harder to maintain cohesion based on something you're for in this environment. Something, a shared ideology or a shared view of the world, and that applies to religion, because it's so easy to pick apart and so easy to snipe at, and it's a source of so much disagreement. And there's a reason all the tribes aren't held together by a shared doctrine or a shared view of the world in sense of what they're for. Because, for instance, say you're in favor of justice. Well, no one can agree on what justice actually means. Somebody says, this is an example, and everybody else would say, wait, that's not the example. This is the example. This is networking kind of fragments that. But they can agree on what they're against. So maybe that's the way out for traditional churches, is to focus less on what they're for and more about what they're against, and building up cohesion from there.
Tyler, you had a question about the long night. I copied and pasted it below for you. You can unmute yourself and read it to John.
Oh, great. Thanks. I was just scrolling up to get it. So in regards to potentially countering the long night, would it be possible in principle to build something that functions as the inverse of the social credit system, instead of centralized coercion into groupthink from above, like in China, something that could potentially be decentralized support for individualism from below?
I think that the first thing you got to do is slow down the pressure to censor everybody. That, our current moves are to, censor everybody who's spouting nonsense or anything that they disagree with. I don't think the dissent is the problem. Can you build a system that protects that dissent, that allows it to form? I think that really comes down to the degree of influence people have over the big social networking systems. Facebook, for instance, it's got 3.5 billion people, right? So if you could influence how they censor and try to keep it as loose as possible, you raise the amount of chaos that's out there, but you preserve that dissent function. It's really a question of how do you balance the two? How do you balance that consensus and with that, with that appropriate amount of dissent? Too much in one direction, you end up more like Russia, and too much in the other, you end up more like China. I don't see those as good outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help? Or I don't know if, that gets into this idea that I've been working on, is this whole changing the way we actually deal with data, and we deal with ourselves online, and that we need a mechanism as powerful as private property was in terms of transforming governments in the 1700s into something that became engines of prosperity and wealth creation. And we've lost that. We don't have that when it comes to the online environment. Our personal data is owned by companies, it's owned by government, it's owned by everybody, and we're protected by this fictive fig leaf called privacy that's ill-defined and varies depending on who's talking about it. Whereas you should own your data, and that everything good starts with that initial ownership.
Any progress in that direction?
No, absolutely none. But maybe you get a little bit of it in some of the stuff I saw in California. But the thing is, it's still, this privacy thing is still getting in the way of every major development. you know, privacy is just, it's like saying, you know, in the 1700s, you don't have to own property. It's just, everyone's just kind of, the state is just renting it to you, or it's a short-term lease, or it just wouldn't work. Ownership is, you know, was the key to providing the mechanism to creating what we have today.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
So this will be the last question. Sear Davis, you had a question on John's, I think that informs his research. I copied and pasted below.
Yeah, I mean, you could just literally read it as such. It's not a complicated question, but yeah, I'm just curious. There's a lot of people doing, you know, social network research at Santa Fe Institute and other places. So I'm curious how much you've looked at their work.
I've read it as it came along. I mean, I've been doing this since, wow, 2001. So 2003 with my global guerrilla stuff. So I was kind of predating most of the stuff we see now. So I've been reading it as it emerged. It's kind of weird. You know, I wrote my first social networking report when I was at Forrester in 1996. So I was going, okay, what's the big thing after the initial internet? And I go, social networking. I called it personal broadcast networks. That everyone would be broadcasting their content, and people would subscribe to each other, and they would create this massive network of shared interaction. And people were like, how do you build this? And a lot of questions on that. And then it took me to 2001 to find a company that was actually building something like that. It was a userland software. We built the radio userland that was like the first blogging platform that had RSS. We came up with the RSS spec and open sourced it and made it possible for the world to kind of do that. Got the New York Times to sign on to using RSS, you know, and they started publishing their stories with RSS in it. And then we started doing the whole interconnection thing, and then it took off, and it became the template for, if you looked at the RSS streams on Radio Userland back in the day, it looked exactly like Twitter in 2002, you know? And so a lot of the early stuff I was doing and writing and trying to convince people that this was actually a useful thing, maybe I did the wrong thing, but getting their heads around it is a lot of the stuff that's driving my thinking now. And I didn't have any real help. There wasn't really a lot out there. You know, I saw something and there wasn't anything. It's like in 2010, I was like, wait, financial crisis hit. We have to figure out something economically to do something. And I tried to do something I called Open Source Ventures, which is kind of like a software-based company that would allocate rewards as an annuity stream based on your participation. So as you accumulated data, and you would get points, and if that data was used to train AIs or as part of an ongoing service, you would get an annuity stream. So people would make, based on what I could calculate, you know, hundreds of dollars per hour investing over the life of the contract or over the life of the venture. So it was like, it was before Bitcoin took off, and Bitcoin would have made a lot of that possible. And it was like, I don't know, I've read a lot of stuff from Santa Fe and other places, and I appreciate all of it. It's awesome. I've read the stuff from Ronfeld and Arkela over at Rand, and I've used to do a lot of stuff, a lot of good stuff came out in First Monday and the like. A lot of independent writers writing about networking. But if you have any sources that are really good that you would like to share, I'd be more than happy to read them. I mean, I'm always open to anything that comes along. I don't have any specific source that I found that was so enlightening that it dominates my thinking, I think. It's kind of formed organically as a result of a myriad of influences over time, because it's almost like, you know, I mean, I did a lot of stuff in the previous world, but when the online world hit in '95, and it was my full-time job as an analyst, it changed my life. It changed the way I thought. Finally, it's an environment that wakes me up, that can actually keep me engaged instead of this kind of horribly slow and turgid, you know, offline world. And it's been that way ever since. So constantly bringing in new resources, constantly finding new stuff, digging into things, letting my curiosity take me where my nose, my instincts bring me. So there you go. That answer it or not answer it?
Yeah, it answers it. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Cool. So we're approaching the hour. There was a lot of questions we didn't get to and a lot of comments. So I'll hop it. I'll send you the chat, John. You can have a read it at your leisure. So is there anything you'd like to leave us with to prep our minds for next week?
Well, think of some good questions we can kick in, because any good question can kick off a 20-minute deep dive. We can go into the origins. We can go into fourth generation warfare and post-Westphalian nation states. We can go into the McLuhan thinking in terms of technology rewiring us, the mechanisms for tribes, how empathy works within the online tribal structures. We can go into the collapse of the Blue Church and kind of the political elements here, and or how the red insurgency took over the Republican Party, and how the network tribes are taking over the Democratic Party now. So yeah, there's plenty of questions, or we could just talk futures, where things are going and how quickly things can degenerate. I put it like a little blow by blow in the Long Night report, kind of a speculation on one potential future, but that's not locked in stone. I just wanted to show the dynamics in action.
Very cool.
Right.
So what's going to happen now? I'm going to stop the formal portion. I'm going to stop the record. We're going to go on a little break. If you want to hang out afterwards, if you can leave, you can leave. If you want to hang out, we'll have like a sense-making session. Maybe we can figure out what should be the next theme that we can post for John. If you'd like to support John or the Stoa on Patreon, you can go here. Yeah, and thank you, John, and everyone for coming today.
Thank you.
Boom.